Good afternoon, everybody. I always hate to break the happy murmur of voices with my own, but let's get down to business. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I direct the Humanities Forum, which happens most Fridays during the semester in this very room. It's an initiative of the Humanities program, which offers the Providence College community the opportunity to learn from leading scholars, professionals, and journalists from around the country and around the world. Here you can engage in intellectual life outside of class, explore diverse perspectives, and deepen your appreciation for the humanities. Today is a very special edition of the forum. It's our spring keynote address of our initiative entitled Virtuous Education, Integrating the Humanistic Tradition with Character Formation. This initiative is made possible by a generous grant from the Educating Character Initiative, which is part of the program for leadership and character at Wake Forest University. So you could think about the fundamental question as something like this. How is it that people grow in character or grow in virtue? And what role does education play in that process? Can reading make you a better person? Can or should college help you grow in virtue? These are questions that maybe we don't think about very often because our modern educational paradigm oftentimes encourages us just to think in terms of careers and income and outputs and productivity. And so we want to change that. Our speaker today is very well equipped to speak to this very topic. His name is Jeffrey Rosen, and he's a leading American legal scholar who serves as the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Washington, D.C. He's the host of a weekly podcast there called We the People. And he's also a professor of law at George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor to The Atlantic. His past credentials include being a staff writer at The New Yorker and The New Republic, and he has been called, quote, the nation's most widely read and influential legal commentator. He holds a JD from Yale and bachelor's degrees from Oxford and from Harvard. Dr. Rosen's books include the New York Times bestseller Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's On Life, Love, Liberty, and Law, as well as biographies of Louis Brandeis and William Howard Taft. But today he's going to be speaking to us about his latest book, you see up here on the screen. It's entitled The Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. Now, just to give you an idea of the format, our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we've got Q&A afterwards, wrapping up at 4:45. And if you've been to one of these before, you know that a student has to ask the first question. Don't let a professor get a word in edgewise. It's on you. The final two things I would urge you, one is put those shiny screens away so that you can not distract yourself or your neighbors and just be present in the room. And then afterwards, head down the hall to the great room. We should have a nice reception there where you can chat with each other about what you saw and heard and thought before you start your weekend. Okay, with that, please give a warm welcome to Jeffrey Rosen.
Hello, friends. Wonderful to be with you, and I'm so glad to have a chance to talk with you about the pursuit of happiness and the unusual COVID reading project that led me down this path to read the ancient moral philosophy that the founders relied on when they put that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence. I want to tell you about this reading journey and how it changed my life. It changed how I think about how to be a good person, how to be a good citizen, how I spend my mornings, and it's turned me into a missionary for the transformative power of deep reading and reflection. So here's the story. During COVID, I noticed that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson chose as their motto for self-improvement a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And first I saw this in Ben Franklin's autobiography. It's the part where he's talking about his efforts in his 20s to achieve moral perfection. He just arrived in Philly, he's trying to make a name for himself as a printer, and he decides to try to be as good a person as he can. So he makes a list of 12 virtues that he later expands to 13. And they include versions of the classical virtues: temperance, prudence, industry, resolution, cleanliness. He saves the one he finds hardest for last, humility. Ba-dum-bum. And he makes a list of the virtues, and they're on the x-axis, and the days of the week are on the y-axis. And every night, he resolves to do a process of self-accounting and to put an X mark in the box next to the virtue where he fell short. He tries this for a while. He finds it's really depressing because there were so many X marks. And he gives it up after a few weeks, but he feels like he's a better person for having tried. I knew about this project because a friend and I tried it in Washington, D.C. About 10 years ago at the suggestion of a local rabbi. In our synagogue, our rabbi recommended a system of character improvement called musar, which means character in Hebrew. And without knowing that it had originally come from Ben Franklin, we practiced this. It turns out that there was a Hasidic rabbi in the 19th century called Mendel Leffen who admired Franklin and translated his virtues into Hebrew. And they're still practiced today for Jews who are trying to become better people. So we didn't know it came from Franklin. We tried it for a while. We put X marks every night next to the virtue where we fell short. We found it's incredibly depressing because there were a whole lot of X marks. And we also gave it up, but we thought we were better for having tried. So I knew about the Franklin system, but what I hadn't noticed before was that Franklin chose as his motto for the whole project this book by Cicero, the Tusculan Disputations, and it said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the beautiful UVA campus. And UVA, as you know, is a complete shrine to Thomas Jefferson, its founder. And on the wall of the hotel room was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters. And they were surprisingly similar to Franklin's virtues. They included resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. But Jefferson also, I discovered, chose as his motto for the project this same Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations. And when he was old and people would ask him the secret of happiness, he would send a passage from Cicero, which he copied into his diary, his commonplace book, when his dad died. Jefferson was 14 when his dad, Peter Jefferson, died. And to console himself, he copied a passage that Cicero had written to console himself when his daughter Tullia died. Cicero wrote the Tusculan Disputations at a time of great personal and political sadness. His beloved daughter died. He's fleeing the factional clashes in Rome. He goes to his villa, and the manual is on grief. Isn't it interesting that the central manual, bless you, for happiness in the founding era is actually how to overcome grief and be stoic even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. And here's the passage that Jefferson would send out. It said, "He who's achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the calm and self-possessed man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man." So I thought, okay, if both Franklin and Jefferson chose this Cicero book as their core definition of happiness, I've got to read Cicero. What else to read? Then I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send out to anyone who asked when he was old how to be educated. He'd send this to kids who were going to law school. He would send this to his friends who were trying to construct a private library. And it's an amazing list. You can check out the whole thing at Founders Online, which is this incredible online resource for all the primary texts of the major founders. And the list really struck me both for its scope and also Jefferson's schedule. The scope is incredible. It includes novels. Jefferson was very big on learning how to live from great works of fiction. Political philosophy, ancient history, science, and law. What caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy. And sometimes Jefferson called it ethics and sometimes natural religion. And at the top of the list was that Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations, and then other works of Cicero, including On Duties, and then Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, Epictetus, Seneca's Letters, and then some Enlightenment philosophers, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Lord Bolingbroke, Adam Smith, and Hume. What struck me about this list is that I hadn't read any of the books on it. And I've had this wonderful liberal arts education, and I am so grateful every day for the incredible teachers in high school and college and law school who kindled my love of English. I was an English major in college, and history and political philosophy and law. But despite all these wonderful teachers, I'd never read these ancient books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum when I was in college. I graduated in 1986, and it was the greed is good decade. There were movies celebrating Wall Street and making as much money as you can. And I was looking for an alternative to basically the materialism and hedonism that were kind of celebrated by pop culture. And I wasn't finding it in the college curriculum. I was studying the Puritans with a great teacher called Sack Van Berkovich, who wrote a great book called The American Jeremiad, which is a wonderful history of Puritanism. And Professor Berkovich notes that all of American history takes the form of a Puritan sermon. John Witherspoon and the original Puritan ministers would denounce the early pilgrims for having fallen short of divine ideals. But like the ancient Israelites, they promised if Americans recovered their devotion to virtue and to following a godly path, then the republic would thrive. And that pattern occurs throughout American history. So that Puritan roots of the American founding are very strong. But at the same time, Puritanism is very rigorous about how you can achieve salvation. Good works will not save you, nor even will faith. According to Puritan theology, only God's randomly given grace can justify. And you can never know. You're predestined at birth, and nothing you do after that is going to affect whether or not you get to heaven. So that wasn't doing it for me, first of all, and most importantly, because I'm Jewish, and Puritan theology was not going to persuade me. And also because I found that idea that purpose-driven life can only be obtained by grace and not by good works or even faith to be unsatisfying, as it was to many in the founding era. So I was looking for an alternative, and what I didn't realize, because these great books had fallen out of the curriculum, is that this is just the question that the ancient moral philosophers set out to answer. How do you live a purpose-driven life, a spiritually meaningful life, by reason and reflection rather than simple authority or even randomly given grace? And the other thing that struck me about Jefferson's reading list was the schedule. It's really intense. He says you got to get up every morning, read moral philosophy for 2 hours, watch the sunrise, then you can read ancient history and political philosophy, then lunch, then science and math in the afternoon, then dinner, then Shakespeare and a little poetry for some light amusement, and then to bed, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no breaks. So I don't know what got into me. It was COVID. We all had more time. I felt I got to read these books. So I tried a version of the Jefferson schedule. Not the whole day, but morning. I got up every morning before dawn. I read the moral philosophy for 2 hours. I watched the sunrise. And I can share, I haven't done this before. There's nothing more beautiful to begin any day than watching the sunrise. It's just extraordinary. And then I found myself writing these sonnets to kind of sum up the wisdom that I learned in the moral philosophy, which seems incredibly weird because I'd never written sonnets before. But I found later that all sorts of people in the founding era would read this moral philosophy and write sonnets, including Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet, the great Phyllis Wheatley. Alexander Hamilton wrote some sonnets, and John Quincy Adams, who's one of my heroes, would wake up in the White House, read the Bible and Cicero, in particular the Tusculan Disputations, and write these really powerful and beautiful sonnets and walk along the Potomac. For me, there's something in the wisdom that was so practical. I just wanted to sum it up. It was like taking notes, and a short little sonnet was a good way to do that. Plus, a friend of mine had just, who runs a Shakespeare theater in California, had just published a YouTube video saying how to write your own sonnet, and it's pretty easy to figure out, so just seeing that as an example inspired me to do it. So that's what I did for a year, and the reading completely changed my life. What I discovered, first of all, is that for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. But by virtue, I came to understand they meant something particular. The word virtue is too abstract for me to really apply it in my life until I realized that for them, virtue meant self-improvement, self-mastery, character improvement. We would say being your best self, using your powers of reason to moderate your unreasonable passions or emotions so you can achieve that calm tranquility and self-mastery that defines happiness. That distinction between reason and passion was crucial in the classical era and also in the Enlightenment era. It comes from Pythagoras. Who knew, I didn't know that before reading this, that Pythagoras, in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, was also a sage who lived on the Isle of Croton and encouraged his disciples to first be good and then be like gods. In other words, to live each day trying to achieve spiritual, physical, and moral perfection. His motto was reverence thyself, a motto that many in the founding era, including Abigail Adams, often cited. And he was very temperate in his eating and drinking. He was a very rigorous vegetarian. There's a beautiful passage at the end of Ovid's Metamorphoses where he describes Pythagoras' vegetarianism, which had one odd exception. You can't eat beans. And he was so serious about not eating beans that his disciples once were being chased by an enemy, and they came across the disciple, and rather than trod on a bean field, they said, "I'd rather die." And the enemy commander said, "Look, I'll spare your life, just tell me one thing. Why won't you eat beans?" And the disciple said, "I'd rather die than tell you," and spat out his tongue, and it perished on the bean field. So no beans, otherwise vegetables are fine. But this was all in the process of self-mastery, of mindfully regulating yourself and achieving a kind of moral perfection. And Pythagoras distinguishes between the faculties of the soul, in particular, reason in the head, passion or desire in the heart, or rather passion or emotion in the heart. Passion is a synonym for emotion in Greek, and then desire in the stomach. And Pythagoras says it's our job to use our powers of reason to moderate our unreasonable passions and desires so we can achieve a golden mean. Plato popularizes this into the metaphor of the charioteer representing reason with two horses. One is noble and the other is appetitive, and the goal is to align them. This idea of the golden mean, exemplified by Pythagoras and Plato, is summed up at the end of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which you know if you've read it. Aristotle famously defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. But those terms are not self-defining. What's excellence? What's virtue? For me, the way of understanding that is the chart at the end of the Ethics, where he has a series of emotions and says for each one, there's an excess and a deficiency. So you try to achieve not exuberance or despondency, but moderation. And in each area, the goal is the golden mean. This is not some sort of mushy compromise, but it's the form of self-mastery and harmony that will ensure that we have productive rather than unproductive emotions. Remember, emotion, pathos, logos is reason. The goal is not to lack emotion, but to lack unproductive emotions. So, emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear are to be avoided, whereas moderation, temperance, prudence, and justice, the classical virtues, are to be sought. And that's Aristotle, and it's all glossed by Plato and Pythagoras. It's really moral psychology. And this was, I subsequently learned, I suspected that you may have seen in Sigmund Freud, he talks about the ego, the id and the superego. And that sounded to me a lot like reason, passion, and desire. And I asked a Freud specialist who's also a classicist, and he confirmed my intuition that Freud probably ripped that off of basically a Pythagoras. And it was he read the classics too, and it's classical moral psychology imported into the modern psychological framework. it's great practical advice. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I did have the honor of collecting our conversations over the years into a book, told me that her mom told her to avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will distract you from productive work. And she was the most self-disciplined person I ever met. She was incredibly mindful of her schedule, using every minute for productive work and also for really being totally tuned in and focused when she was speaking. She was a complete deadline enforcer and always prided herself on turning her opinions in before her colleagues, even when she was ill at the end of her life. And she exemplified this classical Pythagorean self-mastery, which she got from her mom, who learned it on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. She's a Jewish immigrant fleeing the murderous pogroms in Eastern Europe, comes to America, is so devoted to reading and learning that she once breaks her nose on the streets of the Lower East Side because she's reading a book. That's how much that great generation valued reading. And she would read this classical wisdom in things like the McGuffey's English Reader or other books that used to be in American public schools until the mid-20th century. If you have to sum up the ancient and Enlightenment wisdom about virtue, which is also the wisdom of the scriptures too, it's impulse control. There was a test at Stanford in the 1970s where very young kids, who were about 5 years old, are given a choice. If they insist on having one marshmallow immediately, they only get one, but if they can wait for 15 minutes, they get 2 marshmallows. And the kids who could wait did better later in life. They did better in school, they had better relationships with their families and friends, and that ability to resist the immediate marshmallow or chocolate or the high of gratifying your immediate impulses and just thinking for a moment about serving your long-term interests is the definition of virtue and self-mastery and self-improvement. Today we'd call it emotional intelligence. And in fact, the founder of emotional intelligence cited the ancient Stoics, but they talked about self-mastery and powers of reason over passion. So that was the wisdom. And I then set out to see how the founders applied this in their own lives. They insisted on the centrality of virtue to happiness. How did they do? How virtuous were they? Well, what really struck me from reading the primary sources, and it's such an exciting time to study history because all the primary sources are online, and it just blows my mind that I was able to write this book just sitting on my couch at home. You can either read the actual books the founders read or, free editions. And because you can do word searches for all the documents, I just plugged in pursuing happiness or the pursuit of happiness. And the phrase is everywhere. This isn't some secret meaning of the pursuit of happiness that, just a few people noticed. This is in the Christian sources like Wurlitzen and Tolitzen, and the most popular preachers and ministers of their day define happiness this way. It's in moral textbooks like Samuel Johnson, who wrote the core curriculum for Ben Franklin when he founded the University of Pennsylvania. It's in the Whig literature denouncing King George during the American Revolution. It's in Blackstone's commentaries on the first page defining what the purpose of law is. And of course, it's in the translations of the classical writers and also in the Enlightenment writers. And if you look at Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which is the main source for the founding era, you look at the definition of happiness. There are 2 definitions. One comes from the Old English hap, which means luck or happenstance or chance. And the second definition is virtuous self-mastery. And the citation is to John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 55, which uses the phrase the pursuit of happiness and talks about it as self-mastery. It's just kind of hiding in plain sight. And that also solved another puzzle that I long had. Why did Jefferson say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness rather than life, liberty, and property? Because John Locke's second treatise on government famously says we're all born in a state of nature with natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson almost cut and pasted other parts of the two treatises when talking about the grievances against King George. Why didn't he say property? Well, the phrase pursuit of happiness occurs not in Locke's second treatise, but in the essay concerning human understanding, and which defines happiness as an unalienable right. So remember natural law theory? It says that when we move from a state of nature to form governments, we alienate or surrender certain rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. Property is obviously an alienable right. You have to alienate property to exchange it, to get benefit from it and value, and also to give government the power to regulate property so we can enforce contracts. Happiness is unalienable because it's rooted in the rights of conscience. And the rights of conscience, including the right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, are the quintessential unalienable right. I can't surrender to you or anyone the power to control my thoughts and beliefs because they're the product of my reason. I can't entirely control them myself. I'm presented with certain initial thoughts and beliefs. I can decide what to do about the thought and to resist the impulse or to act on it, but it's all based in reason, and I can't surrender reason to anyone else. So that's why we have not only a right, but a duty to think as we will and speak as we think, as Tacitus, Jefferson's favorite historian, said, and also to worship God according to our dictates of conscience, or not, in whatever way we think best, by exercising our powers of reason. And that's why happiness is unalienable, and Jefferson's just making a list of the unalienable rights, and he can't say property, he has to say happiness. And all of this is just obvious from the sources, and it was so exciting to discover all that. What I also found is that the founders talked constantly about their efforts to be better people. They wrote about it in their diaries. They talked about it with their wives and their friends. They were constantly worrying that they weren't being virtuous enough and living up to their potential. And we had a great discussion at lunch about some of you and who were reading the book, and people had different impressions about whether they thought the founders were more or less admirable when they saw how they fell short of their efforts to achieve virtue in so many ways. Some people thought they really were hypocrites and were less admirable. Others admired the effort and the fact that they were trying to become more perfect. But what's absolutely clear is that they thought a lot about it, and in that sense, they're more relatable. It's easy to see them struggling just as we struggle every day to be better people and beating themselves up when they fail. After telling the story of Franklin, I told the story of John and Abigail Adams. John Adams is very relatable. For me, he's the most famously vain and haughty and arrogant guy of his time. He's constantly storming about the fact he's not getting enough credit for the revolution. He is mocked when he's president as his rotundity. He wants to be called his elective majesty. He's very, very haughty, but at the same time, he wears his heart on his sleeve, and he just recognizes his own failings and tries to overcome them. I start with that moment when he meets Abigail Adams, and they're dating. What do they decide to do when they first meet? They decide to make a list of each other's faults, which is not a good dating strategy, I can assure you. But they got it from Pythagoras. They both read the golden verses where Pythagoras recommends every night before bed, make a list of your faults. So they try it on each other. Abigail, knowing that John's reputation is that he's incredibly arrogant and haughty, kind of soft pedals this and says, well, your fault is that you're so brilliant, some people might find you intellectually intimidating. A nice way of putting it. He responds with his typical grace, well, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she says, well, I'll try to read more and practice more, but gentlemen should not comment on ladies' posture. They go on to have one of the great intellectual, romantic, spiritual marriages of all time. And they take all of their passion for self-improvement out on their oldest son, John Quincy Adams. And if I had to pick a favorite from all of the people I wrote about, it might be John Quincy, because he struggled to achieve perfection more mindfully than anyone else. And he set such a high bar for himself. I thought at times growing up that having a Jewish mother could be challenging. It turns out that having a Puritan mother is even harder, because Abigail was constantly on his case. She loved to quote the proverb from the Old Testament: "He who is slow to anger is he who is slow to anger is greater than he who taketh a village." And she's constantly telling him to be more perfect, to be more self-mastered, to make more of himself. And he, as a result, has a constant sense that he's making a hash of things and is squandering his potential. He feels this even as he's going on to, achievements that are among the greatest of his age. He is with his dad in Paris when peace is being negotiated. He goes on to become minister to St. Petersburg, to the Russian court. He's 35 years old or something like that. He's just turned down a U.S. Supreme Court appointment because he wants to stay in Russia. And he writes in his diary, "If only I could find more self-discipline, I might have conquered war and slavery." He sets an extremely high bar for himself. But as it is, I'm spending too much time going to the theater, I'm drinking too much Madeira, I'm getting fat, I'm making a total hash of things. I mean, he's just constant, nothing is ever enough. Despite that, he goes on to even greater achievements. He's James Monroe's Secretary of State, where he writes the Monroe Doctrine, as it happens, and then he's elected president in the contested election of 1824, and then tragedy strikes. First, he loses re-election to Andrew Jackson in 1828, and second, his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. And George Washington Adams, first of all, worried about the pressure. Imagine naming your kid George Washington Adams. Could the son take it? In addition to all that, he didn't help matters by constantly enjoining his son to achieve moral perfection. Quincy was a very close reader of the Bible, and he wrote a series of really powerful letters called Letters from a Christian Father to his son, which are very uplifting and based on his close biblical exegesis. But that's an awful lot of pressure for a dad to impose on a kid. And George Washington Adams descends into alcoholism and then jumps off a steamship. He just can't take the pressure. And Quincy Adams is devastated. He doesn't know how he can continue, and he feels utterly crushed, and he walks in Harvard Yard and he prays for guidance. A rainbow appears, and he resolves to devote a year to rereading Cicero, in particular the Tusculan Disputations, which he reads in the original and is his favorite book, and the Bible. He's a really close exegete of the Bible, and based on his biblical reading, he finds a passage where Jesus promises to free the captives, and Quincy Adams concludes that the Bible prophesied the end of slavery. And based on that original insight, he converts himself into the greatest white abolitionist of his age. And he gets elected to Congress from Massachusetts, the only ex-president to go back to Congress. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He denounces the gag rule, which forbids the introduction of anti-slavery petitions, abolitionist petitions, on the floor of the House. He represents the enslaved population on the Amistad before the Supreme Court, as you'll know if you saw the great movie. He votes against the Mexican War. He says no, and then he collapses on a sofa, and his last whispered words as he dies in Congress are, "I am composed." And he gets this from Cicero. It's just extraordinary. Remember Cicero's definition that Jefferson would send out to everyone about how the perfectly self-composed man is he who's achieved tranquility of soul? That's what Adams had spent his whole life preparing for, a virtuous end to a virtuous life. It's incredibly inspiring. John Adams gives Thomas Jefferson a copy of Quincy Adams' lectures on rhetoric, in particular on Cicero's rhetoric, as a reconciliation present. Remember, they're best friends. They sign and write the Declaration of Independence together. They're side by side during the Revolution, but then they fall out over politics. Jefferson founds the Democratic Republican Party to oppose Adams, Hamilton, and federalism. The country almost comes apart in 1800. We're polarized today, but the roots of our polarization come from that initial battle between Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams. And they don't talk for several years, but then Adams sends as a forgiveness present a copy of Quincy Adams' book, and they start corresponding again. And their letters are among the most inspiring in all of American literature. You've got to check them out. You can get collections of them. And what do they really want to talk about when they're old? Remember, these are ex-presidents. They're just America's greatest heroes. They want to talk about their quest for spiritual self-mastery and the pursuit of happiness. And Adams is so excited when he discovers that Pythagoras, the founder of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Bhagavad Gitas. And Adams, based on his own close reading, is convinced about the deep connections between the Stoic dichotomy of control, which says don't focus on trying to control the thoughts or actions of others, focus on the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and actions and emotions. Adams sees the connection between that and the injunction in the Bhagavad Gita, renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal salvation. And Adams thinks if you can just prove that Pythagoras traveled to the East, you'll see that all of the wisdom of the spiritual traditions of the East and West can be summed up in what he calls the hymn of Cleanthe, and he distills it into the phrase, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. Incredibly powerful insight, very wise in seeing that the central lessons of the spiritual traditions of the East and the West, of the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita and the Dhammapada and the Upanishads, overcome your ego. Stop focusing on yourself, on your own self-conceptions and self-interest. By setting that aside, you can connect to your true self, which is the divine, which is God, and it's the divine light that shines in all. And Adams saw that connection. Jefferson responds that on the basis of his long reading, he's concluded he's no longer a Stoic, but now an Epicurean. But by that, Jefferson doesn't mean a wanton hedonist or pleasure seeker. That's a libel on the Epicureans by the Stoics. Instead, true Epicureanism, according to Jefferson, said we should rationally contract our desires so that we can virtuously meet them. In other words, don't seek things that you, externals that can be taken away from you, like wealth or fame, but focus on self-mastery and living according to nature, and that will be the essence of happiness. It's just, what I find so inspiring, you can find many failings with these men, and I'll talk about Jefferson's in a moment, but they're still reading and learning. This is like they're 80 years old, and they're excitedly trying to trade book recommendations, sharing thoughts about their reading. It's just a beautiful example of lifelong learners, which really is the definition of the pursuit of happiness, and the care that they take to be reading and writing and just engaged in deep spiritual and moral reflection until the end is inspiring. And in that sense, the one virtue that they practiced that almost all these people in this founding generation practiced was industry. You know, because as kids, they were constantly just taught to keep careful schedules and to be using their time productively, and felt they had a responsibility to do that. They're keeping up those habits till the end, and that deep reading is one that they kept up. So that's inspiring. But then, and it's a big but, there's Jefferson and slavery, and there's all the enslavers of that generation. How could they reconcile their devotion to virtue and living a life according to natural law and the Bible with their enslaving of other human beings? What really struck me is that they didn't even try. Later generations of enslavers in the 19th century would defend slavery as a positive good or say that the Declaration of Independence was a self-evident lie, but not Jefferson and not the members of that generation. They recognized that slavery was completely incompatible with the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all human beings are created equal. And in moments of candor, they even recognized their own hypocrisy in not living up to their own ideals. There's this amazing moment where Patrick Henry, the leading anti-federalist of his time and a great revolutionary, is outside the Richmond Town Hall. Jefferson is listening. He's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, which is a quotation from Addison's Cato, his favorite play. And he says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And just stop for a second and think about the incredible candor and kind of shocking honesty of that moment of confession. I know it's wicked, it's immoral, it violates God and nature, but I like the lifestyle and I don't want to give it up. And that was true of all of the members of that generation who were enslavers, most flamboyantly Jefferson, who, at the same time that he was exalting the virtues of industry and frugality and Athenian restraint, is living at Monticello like Caligula, like a Roman emperor. He just is addicted to luxury. He's always going on shopping trips in Paris. He's like a shopaholic and buying gilded mirrors and tufted ottomans, and surrounding himself at Monticello with enslaved population, in particular his own kids. The people who are serving him in his house at Monticello are his children by Sally Hemings. And she agreed to come back from Paris to accompany him only on the condition that he promised to free their kids when he died. And he kept that promise to her. He freed two of his kids in his will. Two others he'd allowed to escape earlier, and then 3 members of the Hemings family, but no one else. And the rest of his enslaved population has to be sold when he dies because of his debts. And parents are separated from kids, and the whole estate has to be sold. Irony is too tame a word. It's a kind of shocking hypocrisy that Jefferson, for whom the avoidance of debt is the centerpiece of his political philosophy. He says that the earth is held in usufruct for the living, so one generation can impose its debts on another. And that's why he says that there should be a constitutional convention every 19 years, so that we, the people today, can make our views clear and not be shackled by the dead hand of the past. And he says one generation shouldn't be able to pass financial debt on to another, and debt should expire, which is why he's so in favor of limited government, low taxes, balanced budget, and against the Bank of the United States. But despite all that, he lives so wildly beyond his means that all of his property, including human beings, have to be sold, and he basically doesn't free any of them. So that's a shocking hypocrisy. And then contrast that with George Washington, who, first of all, does free his entire enslaved population when he dies, and also is the most self-mastered and impressive American of his age. If Jefferson becomes smaller on close examination, Washington becomes greater. He's so devoted to practicing the virtues. That's the source of his greatness. And there's this amazing moment at Newburgh in 1784. The troops are rebelling. There's a coup in the air. There are some who argue that Washington should install himself as the head of a new military dictatorship. Congress won't pay the soldiers because it's broke, because the Articles of Confederation don't allow it to raise taxes, and the soldiers are going to mutiny for that reason, because they haven't been paid, and they're at Valley Forge, and they have no shoes, and they're starving. So mutiny's in the air. Washington mounts a wooden structure called the Temple of Virtue, and he appeals to the soldiers for patience and temperance and prudence and justice, the classical virtues. He has performed for the troops Addison's Cato, the play praising the consolations of mild philosophy, and then Washington goes to read a letter that will assure the troops that they'll be paid if they can just wait a little bit. And here I have my constitutional reading glasses. He takes out his reading glasses, he puts them on to read the letter, and then he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the troops weep. They've never seen him confess humility before. And this extraordinary performance of self-mastery and humility is what makes him such a towering, large figure. In his farewell address, Washington warns that without virtue, the republic will fall. Like all the founders, he's read the histories of ancient Rome and is struck, above all, by the danger of a Caesar who will come, flatter the people with luxuries like cheap corn, and in exchange for bread and circuses and these small luxuries, will persuade the people to give up their liberty and will subvert the Senate and will convert himself into an elected dictator. And Washington says the solution to that is for people to be virtuous, like the Spartans, not to be addicted to luxury, not to sell their liberties to would-be autocrats, but to find the same temperance and prudence and courage in their own souls that they require in the Constitution of the state. And that's why Washington says, drawing a crucial connection, personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. It was helpful for me to hear it put that way. I'm sure you've read the founders always say, without virtue, the republic will collapse. What does that mean? It means unless citizens actually care enough to be temperate and prudent, not to sell their liberties for luxury, not to elect demagogues and dictators, and not to be trying to own the libs and own the conservatives and try to destroy their opponents rather than listening to them, and not being open to differing points of view, and not abandoning the importance of disagreeing without being disagreeable, then this republic will go the way of all the other republics and will fall. So that's Washington's warning in his farewell address. And in particular, he's worried about factions, the new parties under the leadership of Jefferson for the Democratic Republicans and Adams and Hamilton for the Federalists. And he's afraid that these factions will lead citizens to favor their own self-interest rather than the common good. This wisdom is summed up in the Federalist Papers, and you've got to reread the Federalist Papers through this lens, and you see that it's a manual for public happiness. That's a phrase that comes up a lot in the Federalist Papers. And Madison has been reading a trunk full of books sent by Jefferson in Paris about the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. And Jefferson sends this right before the Constitutional Convention. Madison reads them, and he sums up the wisdom by defining a faction as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. There's that reason-passion distinction again. Madison had studied in college Cicero and all these guys, and thoughtfully draws a parallel between the harmony that we're supposed to achieve in the constitution of our own souls and the harmony that we seek in the constitution of the state. And just as in our souls we're supposed to balance reason, passion, and desire, so in the constitution of the state, Madison balances reason in the, I think it's in the presidency, and passions in the House, and desire in the Senate, or something like that. But he does an analog between the separation of powers of the Constitution and the separation of faculties in our souls, and says the goal is to achieve harmony in both. And now we understand the separation of powers in a new light. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The whole system is designed to slow down deliberation, the same way we're supposed to slow down our impulse control. So, in order to avoid the danger of passionate mobs, Madison's really alarmed by the Shays Rebellion in western Massachusetts in 1787, where these mobs are attacking the federal courthouses because the farmers can't pay their debts in light of inflation. And Madison's afraid that unless reason can prevail, mobs will fell the republic. He says in Federalist 55, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. There's that reason-passion distinction again. So that is the central goal of the Constitution, to slow down deliberation. Madison's optimistic about the size of America. Montesquieu, who's their main authority for the separation of powers, had said you can only have republics in small territories where citizens know each other and can deliberate face to face. Madison says that's no longer necessary when you have a representative republic. You don't have to deliberate face to face. Plus, the large size of America might be an advantage because it'll be hard for mobs to organize, and by the time they do, they'll get tired and go home. But in particular, Madison is putting a lot of faith in a new media technology, the broadside press. And he says when citizens read arguments like the Federalist Papers printed in the newspapers, they can discuss them with their representatives, reflect on them, listening to different points of view, never communicating directly with the president, because that would be, the danger of Caesar. Slowly, guided by a new class of statesmen that Madison calls the literati, he hopes that reason will diffuse across the land. Now, even for me to describe this, it's like a joke how far that Madisonian ideal is from our current reality. We all know that in an age of social media, posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason. The business model is enraged to engage, and our whole public discourse is infected by the opposite of cool Madisonian deliberation. Instead, passion and faction seem to be prevailing. Also, the balance that Madison struck between Congress, which he feared would be the most powerful branch, sucking all power into its impetuous vortex, as he said. By contrast, the constrained executive had very few enumerated powers, and the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch, to use Hamilton's phrase. That's all changed. Many complicated reasons for the vast expansion of executive power, which began in the early 20th century. In 1912, both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson insist that the president is a steward of the people and should directly channel their will. Madison would have been appalled by that claim. William Howard Taft is the last constrained Madisonian executive who wants the president to enforce the law but not make it. And ever since then, Democratic and Republican presidents have vastly accreted power, aided by new media technologies that allow direct communication with the people. Meanwhile, Congress has stopped doing its job in the later part of the 20th century and has ceded vast amounts of power to the president, and the powers of judges have accreted. We're having a very important discussion now in this country about whether or not we're seeing simply a continuation of accretion of power in the executive in ways that is well within the normal debate in American history, or whether the presidency in general and our current president in particular are demanding the consolidation of power in the executive in a way that would make the president a king in exactly the way the founders feared. No one knows the right answer to that question, and thoughtful people have different points of view. But there's no doubt that the system that Madison set up has been challenged by these changes in media technology and in the constitutional structure. But one thing that's clear, and I'll wrap up with these thoughts, is that for Madison, so much of the success of the Republic turns on deep reading and on citizens taking the time to educate themselves, not to take their opinions from parties or authorities, but to read the primary texts and to listen to different points of view and to learn the habits of civil dialogue as well as the principles of government. Those are the two things that Washington wanted to create a national university for, to teach the principles of government and the habits of civil dialogue. And he thought people from around the country would come and set aside their partisan differences and learn to listen to each other and debate civilly and virtuously. I'll now share that my takeaway from my weird but completely transformative and fulfilling reading project was to get back into the habit of deep reading. I fell out of the habit of reading. In college, in law school, I did a lot of reading, and I basically became addicted to these screens and spent my time browsing and surfing, and I'd read for my deadlines, but I got out of the habit of reading books unrelated to my deadlines and my immediate work. And just that unusual discipline, of practice, of spending a year waking up and reading books has changed my life. So I have a new rule. When I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I read. And I'm not waking up 2 hours before the sunrise. I still try to catch the sunrise, but I am keeping to the rule. And it's totally transformative. It's just, you learn something every day. I just finished another book on how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson has defined all of American history, which I couldn't have done without this reading practice, and I just can't wait to get up in the morning so I can read something. So I'm just sharing that with you and offer it to you. I know you're in college now, you're studying, you don't have a lot of time for reading outside your classes, but find the time to develop a habit of daily reading. And it's a real challenge. We're all addicted to these screens, adults as well as students, and you have so many distractions and so many excuses for not reading, but there's nothing like reading. It's the only way to learn and grow, not instrumentally, not just for your classes, but just to be a better person. And the marvelous discovery that comes from opening yourself up to new ideas, that's the definition of the pursuit of happiness, is lifelong learning. And we have so many challenges today, and there's so many afflictions in our politics and claims for our attention, but we also live in the most marvelous age in human history when all of these wonderful books are free and online. And it still just blows my mind that I could just get all these books and read them at, sitting at home. And when I was a kid, I went to the Library of Congress in DC with my mom. I think that the Thomas Jefferson building of the Library of Congress is the most beautiful in DC. There are all these paeans to reading and beautiful sculptures and uplifting mottos. And I was so full of wonder as a very young kid at the thought that all the books in the world are in that building. And now they're just on this device, the same device that's distracting me and can be just such a waste of time, is also just a source of infinite learning. And the other thing is, you feel better when you read. You do. It's the difference between eating junk food, which is what I get when I do too much news browsing or whatever, some silly YouTube video, and actually read a book. And it just takes discipline. You got to stick with it. And I'm tempted anyway to set it down and check my email. But if you just stay with it for whatever, a half hour or an hour, it totally changes your life. So that's what I got as practical advice. But more, in addition to that, you have the benefit of going to this great university. You are devoted to a spiritually meaningful life. Many of you within the context of religious teaching. And that's a gift that you have, because when I try to think of why the moral literature fell out of the curriculum when I was in college, even though it used to be so central to what people learned, I think it really is the fact that religious teachings, which used to be more common, are not as widespread in our culture today for lots of reasons. But you have the benefit of being in a university where you're able to encounter this wisdom in the Catholic natural law tradition, in the scriptures, as well as in the ancient moral literature. And it's just a gift to have a framework for leading a purpose-driven life. Because ultimately, the ultimate goal for the classical as well as the Enlightenment Christian authors is to lead a life according to God and nature, so you can connect to the divine. Get outside of yourself. Do not just be so focused on your own immediate worries and anxieties, but to connect more broadly. So that's the goal, and I wish you lots of great enthusiasm for your pursuit of happiness, and would now love to take your questions. Thank you so much.
When the microphone comes to you, if you could just say your name and what your area of study is, that'd be great.
Hey, I'm Joe, theology comp sci double major, and when you talk about kind of how America was designed and how we weren't really meant to be kind of a direct democracy and a direct, I'm kind of curious about clarification here. Were we meant to elect? Was the idea of the Senate, the idea kind of electors in the electoral Congress, to prevent us from electing kind of this dictator and prevent us from making these rash decisions based on emotion, which people do now, as opposed to kind of reasoned decisions, or we're electing people that will reason as opposed to us who are just kind of rash.
Yes, that's a really good way of putting it, certainly for some of the founders. Remember, they disagree about the exact balance between rule by elites and democratic rule, and broadly, the Jeffersonian Party is more in favor of democracy, and especially local democracy, and the Federalists ruled by elites. They all agree on the need for a mixed constitution, which they're getting from Aristotle and Polybius, who says that there are three kinds of government: the ruled by the one, the few, and the many, and ruled by the one. Monarchy descends into tyranny, aristocracy descends into oligarchy, and democracy into the mob. So you've got to balance them all so you don't have one system which can be ascendant. And there's also disagreement about how capable people are to achieve this self-mastery, but they're all afraid of demagogues and authoritarians, and that's why direct democracy generally was to be avoided. Exactly.
Hello, my name is Kelly O'Hearn. I'm a poli-sci major here at PC. Thank you for coming in, and your lecture was very insightful. My question for you basically stems from, you defined happiness basically as self-improvement and mastery in accord with virtue, likely, which also has its own religious basis. But, today we've fallen as a nation so far from that definition, and we seem to define happiness in terms of pleasure, the worst, most slandered definition of hedonism. You sort of alluded to it with the removal of religiosity in society, but could you just go a little further into why that's happened and if it's reversible?
It's a great question. I don't know exactly why. It happened, I think, sometime around the 1960s. Certainly the celebration of hedonism by pop culture made a big difference. And once the revolution of the 60s happened and people began to define happiness as, the me generation and immediate gratification, then that was celebrated. That was what I grew up in the 80s, soon after that changed. But why it happened, there's no single cause. I do think the decline of organized religion and its authority had something to do with it, although that change preceded the 1960s. It was as early as the 19th century and the rise of Darwin that religion began to be challenged. George Will blames the Romantic era, which exalted individual autonomy over self-mastery. David Brooks blames post-structuralist philosophy. I don't think this was not an academic change. It's a fundamental change in the way people live. Just descriptively, though, it's amazing how this wisdom was at the centerpiece not only of college curriculum, but high school and middle school, as well as law school curriculum. I saw a 19th century law textbook, the central one in the 19th century. It has these quotations from Cicero and Aristotle. And if you'll allow just one beat on this, it was also in the most popular textbooks of middle school and high school. And this was not wisdom for elites. You could say this is just for privileged white guys, but Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln got it from the McGuffey Reader and the Murphy's English Reader, the best-selling textbooks of their time. And I said Quincy Adams was one of my heroes. You want a motivation to read books? Think of Frederick Douglass. The moment he feels most enslaved is when his wicked master says that he can't learn how to read. He feels just crushed that they're trying to control his capacity, his intellect. What does he do? He goes onto the streets of Baltimore and buys reading lessons with bread. He pays boys to teach him how to read. Then he buys with bread this Columbian Orator, which is a collection of passages from the classics and a dialogue on slavery that convinces him to become an abolitionist, and he becomes one of the greatest freedom fighters of his time. I feel in the morning I wake up and I feel like I'm going to just check my email and not do my reading. And you think of what people have sacrificed to read and what they sacrifice to get access to books. I can just take the time to read the darn Kindle, you know. So it's not just for the privileged, it's not for elites, but that's how central it was. It was in these readers and stuff that was to define people's sensibility. And it is important what you read. You don't have to read Cicero. Cicero is not a romp. If you want a classical moral philosophy just to check out if you haven't encountered it yet, I suggest a good modern translation of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, one of the greatest self-help books of all times. Millions have found it to be great practical advice about how to live. But it's important what you put in your head, because those images and those thoughts are going to shape your sensibility, your sense of reality. And I think at a time when people didn't have a lot of distractions and the textbooks they read were just so constantly exhorting them to be better people, that affected culture in a way that people lived out. So that's as good as I've got right now. A complicated sources, but a big change, as you said, a huge change. I mean, it was a surprise to me that happiness meant virtue. I didn't know it until I did this reading, but this was just taken for granted until very recently.
Hello, I'm Sister Amata Christie. I'm a former grad student here in Scripture, and now I teach across the street. I recently had the chance to read David McCullough's wonderful book on John Adams, so just this past month. And as I read it, I spent a lot of time reflecting, meditating on how much, as Americans, we owe to the classical education of a very few men, and how their reading changed our founding documents and then set our national ideals and highest aspirations. Okay? And so I've been wondering, and then that book, and now your wonderful presentation, made me wonder if in your research you could pinpoint, like if we kind of track our American moral genealogy back to these founding fathers and then even back to the classical writers, if you could pinpoint any specifically American traits or virtues, something iconic that kind of makes us American today, that you'd say, really could be tied back to the virtues that these founding fathers put into our documents that's changed who we are and how we live that we might not even know about. And or if we're not living it well, or if we've lost the mark a little bit, what you think maybe a couple of those iconic virtues would be for them.
Wonderful question. Just one thing in the beginning, you said we owe it to a few men, and I know you didn't mean it in this sense, but it is important to note the great women who also read this classical wisdom and expressed it as powerfully as the men, like Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet. She just has a couple of months learning the classics because for some reason her mistress decides she can learn with the kids. And she becomes the greatest poet of her time. She writes these poems of virtue. And Mercy Otis Warren, she writes the first anti-federalist history of the United States. She's educated. The women are not allowed to go to university, but Mercy is educated with her brother, James Warren, and she becomes the poetical genius of the revolution and also writes this great history. So it's definitely men and women alike are inspired by this great literature. Classic American traits, absolutely. Self-reliance. That was Frederick Douglass's channeling of the wisdom after the Civil War. He just talked about the right and the duty of self-reliance, self-mastery, individual improvement. What should be done with us? Douglass said, do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the deuce with us. Let us alone. And that great individual spirit of liberty and self-reliance and self-mastery is the American way. Lincoln called himself a self-made man, a phrase he borrowed from Henry Clay, who was also a reader of the classics, and that was his channeling of the expression. And all these exhortations to self-reliance, self-mastery, and the possibility of self-improvement, which definitely goes back to Ben Franklin. I mean, you can't get a better American source than that. His 13 virtues are all practical self-improvement. But what's the power of the American way is that it's not just for capitalistic success. Max Weber, the sociologist, famously said that the success of American capitalism came from the Puritan work ethic, because Americans, because of their religious training, were able to be industrious. They were also able to succeed. And there's some of that in Ben Franklin's, healthy, wealthy, and wise, early to bed, practical virtue. But what's so important about reading the sources is it wasn't just a right that allowed you to get rich. It was a duty that allowed you to be perfect, to be more perfect. And those first words of the preamble of the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union, was not just a political but a spiritual imperative. So recovering that idea that we have not just a right but a responsibility, a duty, and religious people would say that it's a divine duty to God to become more perfect, and that the industry is not just to get rich, but to be better, to learn, to get outside your ego and to serve others, to serve the common good. I think that element of it is crucial too. But that's the American way. It's the American way. It's self-reliance. And for all the disagreement today, I think Americans of different perspectives embrace the American way, embodied in the ideals of the Declaration: liberty, equality, and government by consent. Those are the big ideals of the Declaration, and they're what unite us as Americans.
I'm Paul Heron. I teach in the political science department here. Your lecture brought back a flood of warm memories of one of my college professors who used to always talk about the importance of understanding that the founders had this classical education. You talked a little bit about Madison and the creation of the Constitution and how his kind of understanding of some of this work informed that. I'm curious if you're a law professor, has this journey changed how you think about the Constitution? Has it changed how you think about the institutions created by this generation?
Yes, it absolutely has. I now understand, in much more powerful terms, why they thought virtue was so important. It's changed the way I think about the fragility of democracy and the ways that previous republics have fallen. It's changed the way I think about how much we ask of citizens and why the founders weren't sure the experiment would succeed. There's a great book by Dennis Rasmussen, Fears of a Setting Sun, which notes how pessimistic most of the founders were at the end, because they'd seen the ways of Greece and Rome and were worried that it was just no democracy or republic had been tried on such a wide scale before, and it required such broad self-education. It both required access to education, but also expected a huge amount of citizens to actually become more perfect, and they weren't sure whether it would work. So, and it's also greatly made me even more impressed with the beauty and symmetry of the whole system. Madison drawing a connection between the harmony of the soul and the harmony of the state, and the reflection, putting reason, passion, and desire in the branches of government. I mean, it's kind of dazzling. It's so because there was such coherence to the whole system, because they all had the same education. They read the same books, classical and Enlightenment. Also, the incredible faith in reason. There's such people of the Enlightenment. They think that people can live according to reason, which for them is not only a right but a duty. And also, it helped me realize that it's ultimately a spiritual imperative as well as a political one. Louis Brandeis, another one of my heroes, has an amazing passage. I guess I can do it as a party trick and I'll share it. He's just been reading Jefferson, the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom, and he's defining free speech, channeling Jefferson's reason for protecting free speech. And he says, those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as a means and an end. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. Amazing, he's quoting from Pericles' funeral oration. and I won't do the rest of it. He quotes Tacitus and so forth, but he ends by saying they realized that the pursuit of happiness was a spiritual imperative, and I hadn't realized how central that was. I do not think it's a doctrinal or a sectarian spiritual imperative, and but it's very much, they believe that to be a citizen is also to have a sort of spiritual right and responsibility to be a good person, and that was all a revelation to me. Thank you so much.
That's good.